Hi. So, got a long unit ahead of us, module. In general, we're going to be talking about postmodernity in both the Western and the Russian context. But actually, we're going to be launching into what I mean when I say postmodern culture, postmodernism, next week. And to start this week, we're going to watch a movie, Kindzadza, which I will tell you is my favorite Russian movie. So I always find a way to wedge it in somewhere to some class, and here it is. I want to talk a little bit about the Soviet Union. It's going to be relevant later too in the unit, and I want to talk about Aesopian language in the Soviet context. Now, you're familiar with the term Aesopian in the sense of like Aesop's fables, like these animal fables that have this kind of moral to them. That's not what this is. And the choice of the term Aesopian is not mine. It's what's used in the literature. Russians talking about this themselves, like Russian Soviet scholars. And there's nothing to do about it other than, be aware. It's not Aesop in the sense that we are familiar with. It's a term that has its own meaning in the context of thinking about the Soviet Union and Soviet culture, and so we need to understand it in that way. So Kindzadza came out in 1986, written and made in 1985, and it's worth understanding this historical moment because, again, this is going to be a transition that we work our way through elsewhere too later in the unit when we talk about Pelevin and Oman Ra. Prior to Gorbachev, who doesn't come to power until 1986, so functionally Kindzadza is sort of one of the last movies made under this older regime. Everything must go through Central Command, so to speak. Most film is the official Russian movie making entity. It is government run. Everything that is written must be government approved. Everything that is filmed must be government approved. Everything is subject to government censorship. This is the way of the Soviet Union. There are different periods in Soviet history, so we're going to talk about later on in the class the sort of period right after the revolution. So throughout the from sort of 1917 on through most of the 1920s in Russia is sort of its own era with its own particularities about cultural freedom and so forth, greater cultural freedom until Stalin comes to power. The period of high Stalinism, with the heavy enforcement of socialist realism culturally, but also just terror politically, and for the citizens, is its own era. After Stalin comes Khrushchev in the 50s with a thaw. You get some greater cultural freedom in terms of what you can publish, what you can even say. Then there's this kind of period throughout the 60s and 70s, which is when, Danilya, who is in fact Georgian, so he's a member of the USSR as a citizen. He's a Soviet citizen, but he's technically a Georgian, and so that informs something about this film too, as you'll see, and hopefully we can talk about on Thursday. But sort of grows up in this sort of post-Khrushchev period. Begins to work in the 60s and 70s, this period known as stagnation in the Soviet Union, where you had just this Brezhnev, and then into the 80s, these other old men, just old, ancient-ass men, who do not want to see any kind of reform in the Soviet Union, even if it's for the best, even if it's to help the Communist Party, just this very, ugh. We'll talk more about that when we talk about Oman Ra. But suffice to say, in the 1980s, the Soviet Union is characterized, one, by the reignition of the Cold War, with Reagan being elected in America, restarts the Cold War with Russia. This all begins to change under Gorbachev, and we'll talk about that. And Gorbachev brings about glasnost as well as perestroika and glasnost is more important for our purposes, this sort of cultural freedom where you have much greater freedom to to write and to publish and to make films and etc., with just greater literary and intellectual and film freedom. But I said, Kinzadza, although it comes out in 1986, is not, Gorbachev's reforms haven't taken hold yet. So, under censorship, basically. So, all this time in the Soviet Union, if you wanted to criticize the government, how could you do it? Of course, lots of people wanted to criticize the government, and it's more and less dangerous at different times. And this is true not just during the Soviet Union. Actually, this is true under the Tsars as well. There's a period in Russian history right after the revolution to a bit after Lenin's death in the mid-20s where there really is freedom, like intellectual and artistic freedom in the USSR, more or less. And that's it. Because the Tsars themselves were heavily censorious, and so this Aesopian language that I'm about to describe to you is not just a Soviet phenomenon, it's a Russian phenomenon. It goes back to under the Tsars too. Aesopian writing, or in our case filmmaking, is a mode of writing in which you make a critique, but you make it in such a way as to have what I can best call plausible deniability. And I say it's a mode of writing because it can involve many, many different things. So, in our case, genre. Books and films that were critical of the government were often science fiction, fantasy, children's literature. Genres that the government did not suspect quite as much, didn't think were as likely to be political. And of course you could always go to your censor and be like, what, this is happening in a castle with a dragon. This isn't about anything real. This is happening on a planet in another galaxy. This isn't real. What are you talking about? You sound crazy, right? It can be displacement in time. This happened in Russia, but it happened well in the past. I'm talking about the reign of Ivan IV, not the reign of Stalin. Right? Displacement in time. I'm not criticizing the Stalinist regime. I'm criticizing Hitler's fascist regime. Did you think this was about Stalin? No. Perish the thought. Right? The use of irony. The use of over-exaggeration, the use of metaphor and analogy, and all sorts of, right? I mean, it can bring in many, many things. And the idea here is that the producer of the art and the audience have an understanding. And this is something we are not familiar with. This is not something we have to do in America. We're not trained to read and watch like this. It seems foreign to us. But Russian people know to read and watch with an eye towards what the creator is, let us say, smuggling to you. So there's signal and there's noise. In a free society, you want your signal to be as clear as possible. You want to make your point as clear as you possibly can to your audience. In an unfree society, you want them to receive your signal, but you need to bury it in enough noise so as to plausibly be able to say to the censor, who might be putting you in jail, or worse, I don't know what you're talking about. This is clearly not that. You're reading way too much into this. You're paranoid, right? And so, as a mode of writing, this is a kind of triangulation between the creator and the audience and the censor. And the censors knew about this. It's not that they were stupid people. And so that you would have, and particularly in filmmakers, Danelia actually, when working on this movie, on a couple of occasions, like, submitted stuff, and the censors were like, no, and he's like, what about want this? And they're like, oh, okay, we'll let you do this if you take this out. Right? I mean, like, this is, I mean, the censors are not stupid people. Either they understand what's happening, they have jobs to do, they're not trying to lose their jobs or go to prison, etc., either, but they're, right, I mean, so this is a relationship. And it's this triangular relationship between the audience and the maker and the censor, and what will be allowed and what will not be, and how much signal and how much noise. Because at a certain point, too much noise, you can't, you know, the signal will be lost even to people who are trained to look at it. And so the other thing about this is that, in a way, context is vital. In order to understand the signal, you must understand the historical context of what's going on in Russia at the time that is being, like, Aesopian language mode criticized. Because if you don't, you could be the savviest reader or viewer in the world, and it will be impossible for you to understand. So, for instance, with Khin-Zsa-Dzaa, you must understand that in the 1980s, in the Soviet Union, because of economic stagnation, which took place for various reasons of poor leadership going back at least 15 years, because of the reignition of the Cold War, which caused a redistribution of sort of funds and resources and priorities within their centrally controlled economy, the consumer economy of Russia in the 80s was a nightmare. So everything is happening on the black market. And I mean, I don't mean things that we usually associate with the underground economy. I mean, like, your toaster breaks, and now you're like, oh God, now I have to go talk to a mobster about a toaster. Right? I mean, that level of consumer goods shortages. And meanwhile, the government is just rampaging through the land, sucking up resources, sucking up effort and energy to build what was already, you know, one of the two biggest militaries in the world into an even bigger military. Right? And America's doing this at the time, too. I mean, on both ends of this, it's just an extremely stupid thing to do. But in Russia, this means that the centrally planned economy is just redirecting everything out of the production of consumer goods into this kind of military and heavy industrial production. One, tremendous pollution and resource degradation and so forth, and that's something you'll see in Khin-Zsa-Dzaa. I mean, one way to read this movie is about Russia destroying its own environment. But another thing is about shortage. The shortage of just, like, basic things that people need, and the difficulty in regular people just trying to get the things that they need. I mean, it's not that people were starving, right? I mean, nothing like that is happening, but just this just profound, like, sort of frustration and inconvenience and sense of bureaucratic mismanagement and sense of frustration, right? Yeah, Chief is talking at me. I don't know if you can hear him. He's a good boy. And so, going into Khin-Zsa-Dzaa, I'd like you to be thinking about what the noise is, which is... Yes, buddy. Which is another way of thinking about when Danelia goes to the censors. What does he say this movie's about? There he goes. He made it up here. What does he say this movie's about? And I mean, not to give it away, but at one point, the main character in the film, Uncle Vova, stands there looking over this wasteland and goes, "Capitalists." And the movie can function in that way. You will for sure see some things that if the movie is read as a criticism of America, of American culture and American economics, particularly with, frankly, racism, an analogy for racism in the film. One thing that the Soviet Union hammered America on for decades was how racist our country was. Just, you know, all during the Cold War, the ideological battle between the two countries in terms of propaganda, but especially in terms of both countries trying to extend their influence around the world over and over. And justifiably, the Soviet Union hit America repeatedly on the racism of our society, and that's present in this movie, and you can see it. And so, okay, this is a way in which you can, the straightforward way in which to read this film is, you know, they declare it's about capitalism. You'll see many ways that this can be a critique of capitalism, a critique of American society, and I'd like you to be thinking about that, because that's the explicit plot of the film, right? A sort of way to understand it. Implicitly, the Aesopian reading of this is that this is a critique of the Soviet Union at the time. The squandering of resources, the difficulty of everyday people navigating the world to get their basic needs met, the corruption of the government. There's a way to read the film that way too, though of course theoretically, right, that's not allowed. So it has to be hidden. It has to be. And so, thinking about this, what I'd like you to do, and there's other things in this film too. I said Danelli is a Georgian, and it's not for nothing that the other main character is a young Georgian man, versus, you know, our Russian, and so there's our Russian lead, Uncle Vova, is an older man. He's paternalistic a bit. He's characterized in a certain way. Our young Georgian, compulsive pickpocket, but nice guy, is characterized in a particular way that clearly mirrors something that's going on in the Soviet Union at the time about these kinds of Soviet ethnicities. And that's something that you don't really have you don't have the context to really understand that. We can talk about it a bit on Thursday, though, in thinking about these sorts of, you know, the satellite cultures that the Soviet Union took in and sort of partially assimilated into the Union. So there's a few things going on in this film. But what I'd like you to think about, in part as you watch it, especially, is these two readings, right? That there is the straight-ahead, censor-approved, government-approved way to understand this film as, although it is science fiction, it is critiquing American capitalism. There is the Aesopian mode, which it is possible to read as a critique of the Soviet Union at the time. But that must be plausibly deniable. I'd like, as you watch, for you to try and map both of these things and sort of see where and how this, where and how this is simultaneously happening, and by what methods the director is creating this double meaning, this double simultaneous potential readings of the film. And then the other thing that I'd like to set us up to think about is just that, you know, this is the style of filmmaking that is sanctioned, this realism. Even though this is a science fiction movie, in terms of style, like the way the movie is, you know, shot, the visuals, the editing, everything, along, you know, the sound, all of that is very realistic. That realism is what's allowed in terms of artistic style in the Soviet Union. As we see, once the Soviet Union collapses, we get different styles of both filmmaking and writing, literature, different literary styles. Just pause for a second there. And what it means to talk about Russian postmodernism when we get there is partially to talk about ideas, like philosophical ideas. But another thing is to talk about style itself, the rendering of film, and in literature. And this is kind of a contrast in a way, to the things that we are going to talk about both in Russia and in the West. You know, this kind of this very cinematic realism, sci-fi or not, versus other possibilities that we'll see later. So, kind of keep an eye on that. Chief says we're done here, and fair enough. What's the film? And we will talk about these things on Thursday.